Hello, everybody. Hoping that you're all joining us rapidly. I can see the numbers going up on the bottom of my screen. I think we're up to 65 now, and we're expecting over 100. So just give everyone a few more seconds just to join. And then I'll introduce ourselves, do a bit of housekeeping, and then hand over to Bill. Okay, so we're up to 90, which is really good. Welcome to everyone who's just joined. Up to 92. Yeah, I think I'm going to make a start now because this session's being recorded. Okay, so I'm delighted to welcome everybody here today to this presentation about how family mediation can work with high conflict personalities. And I'll be introducing the great Bill Eddy from the High Conflict Institute of America in just a minute. So a few words about me. I'm chairing the meeting today. My name's Elaine Richardson. I am a family solicitor. I'm an accredited child inclusive mediator. I'm a supervisor and I'm also a trainer. My connection with Bill is that I'm trained by Bill at the High Conflict Institute as a mediation coach and also to conduct mediations involving high conflict. The mediation coach work is really interesting. At the moment, I'm working with a charity up in Scotland called Shared Parenting Scotland, where parents can be coached and trained in methods to try and reduce the conflict in their relationship as parents, separated parents. And Bill, I know, will be talking a little bit more about that later on. I'm also delighted to welcome today James Evans from Our Family Wizard. And I'm going to hand over to James now, just so that he can introduce himself. In terms of housekeeping, please put any questions you've got in the Q&A. And what will happen is, during the presentation, we may ask a few questions of Bill. James and I will be looking out for those questions, but whatever questions there are at the end, Bill will answer them, so don't worry. Okay, over to you, James.
Thanks, Elaine, and good evening, everyone. Thank you ever so much for joining us. So as Elaine said, I'm James Evans. I'm the head of UK professional education at Our Family Wizard. Our Family Wizard are absolutely delighted to be sponsoring Family Mediation Week. This week, we're getting involved with all sorts of different talks. And for those of you who aren't coming to more than just this one, please do check out the web link on the FMC website and have a look at what else is going on and join as many of those sessions as you can. There's so much great, interesting stuff for you to listen to this week. As Our Family Wizard are delighted to be involved. If you don't know Our Family Wizard, please do have a look on our website, ourfamilywizard.co.uk. You can find out all about our co-parenting app and how we support families going through divorce and separation. I've known Bill for a couple of years now, and I've had an absolute pleasure of working with him in different situations. Our Family Wizard have actually worked with Bill for a long time. We started out in America in 2001, a similar sort of time as Bill. So the relationship and journey we've had with Bill has been both international and long-lasting, which gives me a huge honor to be here. We've worked with Bill in the UK as well, as he brings his work over here with the High Conflict Institute, and you'll hear more about how that's looking in the UK from Bill as well. And I'm on hand to help with any questions relating to that work or anything else I can do to support. I'll pass it back to Elaine before we hear from Bill.
Thanks very much, James. So I'd just like to introduce now Bill Eddy. He is the co-founder and chief innovation officer of the High Conflict Institute based in San Diego, California. Bill pioneered the high conflict personality theory and has become an expert on managing disputes involving people with high conflict personalities. Bill was the senior family mediator at the National Conflict Resolution Centre for 15 years. He was also a certified family law specialist lawyer representing clients in court for 15 years and a licensed clinical social worker therapist with over 12 years of experience. So you'll see that's just a fantastic combination of qualifications and experience there. Bill serves on the faculty of the Strauss Institute for Dispute Resolution at the Pepperdine University School of Law in California, and he is a conjoint associate professor with the University of Newcastle Law School in Australia. He's been a speaker and trainer in over 35 US states and 13 countries. Bill is the author or co-author of over 20 books, manuals, and workbooks. He's the co-host of the podcast It's All Your Fault that he co-hosts with Megan Hunter. And I have to say, I've always listened to that. It's the most fascinating podcast. It is my go-to favorite podcast. So for anybody out there who wants to learn more about high conflict, the conversation between Bill and Megan is absolutely fascinating. Bill's also got a popular blog on the Psychology Today website, and that has over 6 million views. So I'm delighted to hand over to you, Bill, and thank you so much for coming to speak to us today.
Thank you so much, Elaine, and also James. So I'm very pleased to be speaking with you from across the pond, I guess they say. And I'm really excited to share the idea that mediation can work with high conflict situations, because for many years, people thought high conflict disputes just couldn't work in mediation and often were in court. And sadly, court often increases the conflict. So being able to deal with high conflict disputes in mediation is exciting, but also needs to be handled somewhat differently. So I'm going to go through here. And first, I always like to talk a little bit about the brain, because the brain's got a lot of different departments and different tasks. And some people say the brain is really several different brains. But if you think about it, our left brain, a lot of people are aware that's where we process language. So talking, reading, listening, etc., is processed primarily by the left hemisphere. But researchers also say this is where logical problem solving is. And so this is where, when people sit down to make agreements, like in mediation, that in many ways they're looking at solutions, and the left brain is looking at solutions, looking at details, planning for the future, generally conscious, rational, all of that. Now, the right brain, in many ways, is a protective brain. And the right brain seems to be doing more nonverbal stuff, looking out for us in the world. How are we doing? Are we in danger? Do we need to run or fight? Things like that. So the right brain observes more nonverbal behavior, facial expressions, tone of voice, hand gestures, all of that. Well, one thing that's been figured out is when someone has a high conflict personality, they're spending more time reacting, that they're reacting as if they have to protect themselves from extreme danger, when in fact it may just be a problem-solving situation. So when thinking about mediation with high conflict people, we have to think of how do we calm the emotions so we can focus on problem solving. So you're going to see as I walk through this how we structure the approach so that we can calm emotions while we acknowledge them, but we can focus on problem solving. So first, just a little bit about high conflict personalities. That's not a diagnosis, it's an observation of behavior. But high conflict personalities tend to be preoccupied with blaming other people. And if you, by the way, notice anyone that has these characteristics, please don't tell them that you think they're a high conflict person, because that triggers that emotional defensiveness. So instead, think about adapting what you do. So they're preoccupied with blaming others, and you can't really argue them out of that. So we need to steer around that when we're doing mediation. They have a lot of all or nothing thinking. They see problems as all one person's fault, somebody else's fault, and they see solutions as there's just one way. It's my way or the highway, buddy. That's what they often say. There may be unmanaged emotions, which can be very intense and take over their thinking. So they're no longer logical, even driving them rather than logic. It's that right brain defensiveness rather than that left brain problem solving. And then extreme behaviors. And extreme behaviors basically can be things that 90% of people would never do. So we see things like domestic violence. We see things like spreading false rumors on the internet. We see things like damaging people's property, all of those kinds of things. Extreme behaviors that 90% of people would never do. So sometimes that jumps out at you. I used to say you need to see people's behavior over time to see if there's a pattern of extreme behavior, but sometimes just one thing points out to you, wow, very few people would do something like that. That might be a high conflict person. Now, realizing that someone might be a high conflict person means that it's a good idea for you to adapt what you're doing rather than trying to tell them and change them and say, here's what you have to do. Instead, look at what you can do differently. So these are 4 things that we encourage people to avoid if you think you're dealing with a high conflict person, or you can use these with anybody. First is to avoid trying to give insight into the person about how they're behaving, about their personality, all of that, because that triggers defensiveness and doesn't trigger insight if they're a high conflict person. And that's the paradox. People say, well, shouldn't I point out what they're doing wrong and tell them, you've got to, buddy, you've got to look at yourself. And the thing is, they can't look at themselves. But once you realize that, you realize, okay, I need to focus them on what to do now, on what their choices are now. So rather than going for insight, I say, let's look at our choices now. And they may not be great choices, but people always have a choice. The second is to avoid focusing on the past. You may need to talk about the past some, but you want the focus to be on the future. Because what we see is people with high conflict personalities tend to get stuck in the past. They're constantly talking about the past and defending what they did and criticizing what other people did. And so once you get into the past, you get stuck with them. And they often have what we call cognitive distortions, that their thinking distorts the past, distorts how they see things. So they may jump to conclusions. They may have all or nothing thinking, things like that. And so when you get into the past, you're not really dealing with exactly what happened. You're dealing with their perception of what happened, and you can't resolve that. It's just an endless argument. And so rather than arguing about the past, which just makes things worse, is really focusing on the future. Let's talk about what we can do in the future. And in a few minutes, when I talk about the mediation process and how we've adapted that to help keep the focus on the future. So we really don't want people spending time talking about the past, because we know that will get stuck. It's kind of like quicksand. The more you focus on the past, the more you get stuck and sink in. The third thing to avoid are emotional confrontations or even opening up emotions. What we've learned is that people with high conflict personalities don't grieve and heal the past, that they get stuck in the angry stage. And if you're familiar with the 5 stages of the grieving process, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, and there's variations, people go back and forth among those stages. But what happens is high conflict people get stuck right away in the anger stage. And so they don't go through feeling depressed, vulnerable, and then getting to acceptance. So that's one thing people notice is people with high conflict personalities don't get to acceptance. So they're always fighting what's happened because they don't have a mechanism for healing a loss and moving forward. So they're stuck. They're trying to rewrite history as a way of feeling better because they don't seem to have this healing mechanism, which is actually quite sad. But it also means if you focus on emotions, there's a lot of unresolved emotions there. And you're going to be looking for trouble if you open up and focus on emotions. And so we want to steer away from that and have people focused more on thinking and doing. And in a mediation process, you can do that. You can always have a task that someone's working on that involves thinking or doing rather than reacting and getting emotional. Of course, the fourth thing to avoid is not telling people they have a high conflict personality, because this just triggers defensiveness, makes it harder to work with somebody. So just focus on what to do. That's really where we want to go. So I'm going to walk through adaptations of the mediation process. And I know that there are people online who are mediators, who are lawyers, who are people, ordinary individuals looking at whether maybe mediation is what they need to do to solve a problem, or going through a divorce, for example, or any other kind of dispute. This structure is designed to work with what I've just explained. It helps keep the focus on the future. It helps keep the focus away from emotions onto tasks and problem solving. So 4 steps, basically establishing the process and letting the clients ask questions, then having the parties make their agenda with the assistance of a mediator, having the parties make proposals with the assistance of the mediator, and then having the parties make their final decisions. So in terms of establishing the process of mediation, it helps to know that there's jobs for the mediator and jobs for the parties. So the mediator's job is not to make decisions. And that's one of the things we've talked about for the last few decades, is educating people that mediation is a process where the parties actually make the decisions with the guidance of the mediator. So the mediator controls the process, guides the process. The mediator answers questions that they can, and this may or may not be legal questions because the mediator may not have the legal background on a certain subject matter, and that's something for lawyers to answer. So a lot of mediations have lawyers involved who they can be the ones that answer the legal questions. But the questions the mediator can answer are things like, what have other people done in these circumstances? And so my own experience as a mediator, a lot of issues are kind of similar and come up again, and a lot of solutions are somewhat similar. And so I can answer those kinds of questions, even though I can't say what the law is on this issue. I say you need to talk to a lawyer about that. Letting people know what different options are, because there's usually in mediation several different ways that you can solve a problem. And that's one of the benefits of mediation versus going to court, where a judge has to do it exactly according to narrow range of options, or maybe only one option in terms of what the law dictates. But in mediation, the parties can be more flexible. And that's one of the appeals of mediation. Now, the parties' role. So there's 4 tasks in this process, the way we've designed this, what we call new ways for mediation for high conflict cases, or for any case, you can use this approach. First is the task of asking questions. A lot of times, people with high conflict personalities like to tell other people what to do. And as a mediator, I've had many cases where parties come in and one or even both people sometimes say, now, Bill, here's what you have to do. You have to make him understand such and such, or you have to make her agree to such and such. Well, that's not my job as a mediator. I don't make people do things. I provide a structure, guidance, and information. So asking questions kind of puts more rational thought, remember that more left brain thinking, onto the parties so that they bring out the best in themselves, bring out what they understand are the issues and how they want to solve them. So encouraging and teaching people to ask questions is a really key part to start out the mediation process. Now, making their agenda. Now, mediators, and basically I've been a mediator for 40 years, the past 15 years were exclusively mediation. And I used to make the agenda. I'd hear from each party, they'd have an opening statement, and then I'd kind of figure out, okay, sounds like these are the issues, this is the order that you should address them in, I think. Well, over the last 15 years, developing this approach for mediation with high conflict cases is what I've learned is this is a task, actually, it's better if the parties handle. Now they need guidance, so I'll say, okay, who wants to go first? Tell me your proposed agenda. And then each person does that, and then we work on developing the agenda for this meeting. But by having the parties do this, they're busy thinking, using their best thinking for problem solving, rather than the mediator doing that while the parties are reacting and rejecting things. So this structure, and by the way, I think it's best with this structure if you have a mediator who has this orientation. But actually anybody, you can sit down with somebody and you think you've got to solve a problem, is have them participate in making the agenda, because that really gets people thinking rather than reacting. Then making proposals, and I'll explain this, and then making their final decisions. Now, the focus is on the future, and this is so important for mediators to emphasize in this method, is we're going to have very little discussion of the past, because as the mediator, you don't really need to know the past. You're going to help the parties. The parties know the past, and they know it from their own perspective, and I expect that that perspective is going to be different. So they basically, whatever they think of, they're going to turn into their proposals. So I don't need to know much about the past, and I know that people get stuck in the past if you let people talk a lot about the past. And so we're going to focus forward. So the future is the focus. I can't mediate the past. You don't have to agree on the past, and you don't have to defend the past. And that often relieves people. It's like, oh, good, let's just look at what to do now to solve the problems we're facing. And then, of course, all mediations have some basic ground rules, confidentiality, taking breaks, things like that. Okay, second stage is making the agenda, and I already explained some of that. So we don't do an opening statement. Now, if I'm doing a civil mediation with lawyers and they have mediation briefs, I make sure that I have those a day or two ahead of time. And so I read those, and then when it's time to meet, I say, I've read your briefs. Thank you for that. I think I've got some good background here. Now we're going to talk about your questions about today's process. So I don't need an opening statement. I've already covered the past from the briefs. If you don't have mediation briefs, you still don't really need that background. What you need is to structure the process so that the parties take whatever from the past and turn that into proposals for the future. So we don't open things up with an opening statement or say, what are your points of view or what the concerns are that brought you here. And I used to do those. And with ordinary mediation, you can do that. But with high conflict mediation, you really want to steer clear of the past so people don't get stuck in that quicksand. And then there'll be questions and answer the questions, could be information, but not advice, talk about options, what others have done. So what we do then is just say, are there any questions about the mediation process or the decisions that you're facing? Now, in family mediation, this often includes parenting plans, child support, spousal support, property division, the legal process, timing issues if someone's about to move, if a house has to be sold, all of those things. So you want to make sure people have information about that. And by giving some basic information at the beginning, then it doesn't seem like you've taken sides. So sometimes the basic information favors one person or favors the other point of view. You want to say it early on. Here's a bit of background. I like to say I'm going to give you my 2-minute seminar on each of these subjects. And then I give a brief little seminar, parenting plan. You can agree to almost anything. But if you want to change it in the future, by agreement, you can do that. If you don't agree and you go to court, the judge may not want to change things because they want stability for kids. Things like that are pretty universal worldwide. All your formulas, child support, etc. So by asking people, what are your questions, it gets people thinking about the present and the future, rather than saying, you know what he did last week, or you know what she did last month. Process and where to go from here. Then have each person say what they propose to put on the agenda. And so who wants to go first? And that's one of the things that's interesting about this process, is having the parties decide who goes first. As a mediator, I used to decide, okay, let's have the plaintiff go first, or the person that filed go first. But by asking the parties, this is little joint decisions that they make. And the more little joint decisions they make, the more practice they have for making big joint decisions. So who wants to go first? Who do you agree will go first? And then write down what their proposed agenda items are. And then, okay, what order do you want to address these in? So in family mediation, we certainly have many different issues. Other mediation, civil mediation, sometimes personal injury, there's just one issue, and that's the number. Who's going to pay who for whatever damages there were. But the reality is, even those situations have a few different issues: future communication, breaking it down into parts. So this is a chance to get people really thinking, and that really builds more flexibility for problem solving. Now, the third stage is making proposals. Now, professionals who are trained in interest-based negotiations are going to say, whoa, Bill, what happened to interest? Aren't you going to explore each other's interests and talk about interests? And what I want to say is I loved interest-based negotiation. I still have my Getting to Yes book from 1983, which is now 40 years old. The cover is quite faded. But yes, so interest-based negotiations is a great approach. And frankly, the last 40 years, that's changed the way people negotiate. Because if you see what your interests are, you can fit them together better. Well, what happens in high conflict cases is it's hard for people to see their interests. And so someone with a high conflict personality says, I don't have any interest, I'm just right. And they pound the table. Or the other person doesn't have any valid interests, they're just wrong, and they pound the table. So rather than get caught up into arguing against that's not about right and wrong, is just say, let's focus on what your proposals are. And so people come in with proposals, and often people with high conflict personality know exactly what they want. And so we say, well, that's a proposal. So they come in with positions, but we reframe those as proposals. So we say, hang on, what's your proposal? Let's turn this into a proposal. And so I think of a mediation that I had. A couple came into my office. Now, a lot of mediations have lawyers with the parties. A lot of my mediations don't have lawyers in the room. They may have lawyers that they consult with. But I'll give this example. They come into the room and they sit down. The wife starts pounding the table, says, I'm getting the house. I'm getting the house. And I said, oh, that's a proposal. We'll be getting to those soon. And she says, it's not a proposal. It's what has to happen. And I said, well, in mediation, we have to discuss things before they happen. So you sound like you have a proposal ready. So when we get to proposals, you can propose, you get the house. And then the other party is going to ask you questions about it. And so that's the idea, is someone comes in just with this rigid idea, is to turn it into a proposal and then have a chance to discuss that. So the way this works, one person makes a proposal. I want the house. Then the other person has to ask questions about it. Now, a lot of times people with a high conflict personality react to proposals. And they say, why did you ever think I would agree to that? Well, that's not the kind of question we want. We want a who, what, when, and where question. So in the house situation, the husband says, well, how can you afford to keep the house? Have you talked to an appraiser about the value of the house? Have you talked to a mortgage lender? Well, turns out she had. And she said, on my income, I can't keep the house, but with the support that you're going to pay me, plus my income, I should be able to keep the house. And so his questions focused on problem solving. So you can see here, we've got that left brain problem solving going on about a very potentially upsetting issue. So then the other person, after they ask questions, says yes, no, or I'll think about it. So in the house question, the husband says, I'll think about it. He's got a good income. He can, with the property he's getting from their divorce, he can put a down payment and get another house. So he's open to her getting the house, but it has to be clear that it's feasible. So he'll think about it and gather some more information. And so that's how this proposal process works. Then you say, how much time do you need to think about it? Well, give me a week. I need to do a little research, and then we can meet again. So proposal, questions, response. Proposal, questions, response. If he said no, and he said, I want the house, then it now would become his turn to make a proposal, and she would ask questions of him. Can you afford it? Can either of us afford it? We may need to sell it, and what happens if we sell it? And so this is information gathering, but you get the sense that the whole thing revolves around information, problem solving, logical stuff, because it's structured away from reacting. So when someone says, that's a horrible proposal, I hate that, you say, hang on, what are your questions? Ask at least 2 questions. And people say they feel their brain shifting. And I think it might be maybe from the right to the left side when they think of questions, because questions are problem solving. So if they don't have agreement, rather than the mediator asking a lot of probing questions, which opens up the past and is common for mediators in ordinary cases, instead, talk about other options. That keeps it forward-focused, forward-moving. Try to talk about at least 3 options. Gets people thinking, because if you just have one, they go, okay, well, I agree with the mediator, and the other person says, well, I don't. And now you're just feeding the argument. If you have two options, one likes one likes the other, you can get stuck. 3 makes people have to think. So experienced mediators in a subject matter area can say, well, here's 3 different approaches people have used. Does that help you think of a new proposal? And of course, they still don't agree, getting more information, consulting with outside resources, etc. Then the 4th stage is making final decisions. And again, this is for the parties to really be engaged in thinking about. Asking for the details, when would things start? With parenting plans, who would bring the child? What would the schedule be? How could you change the schedule? What about holidays? Things like that. For issues they've been thinking about, make sure you find out if it's a yes or no, or they need more time to think. If they appear to have an agreement, encourage them to think about it and see if this is really what they agree to. Because sometimes high conflict people change their mind after they've made an agreement. And so you want any mind changing to happen while everybody's right there so you can get this resolved. You don't want to get that Monday morning phone call, well, the other person didn't do what they agreed to. Now what should we do? You want to build into the agreement what should be done if people don't do what they've agreed to do. Especially in high conflict cases, the more details, the better, so that you avoid that. But have the parties think of the details. They know the situation. They know what some of their options are. Warn people about buyer's remorse, that sometimes people in the moment agree to things and afterwards say, oh no, I don't know why that happened. I don't know why I agreed to that. Well, remember, high conflict people have to process things emotionally as well as logically. And so if they're being logical in the mediation process, they go home, then they might be emotional about it and go, why did I ever do that? And then they call up, say, why did I agree to that? Sometimes the mediator can say, well, remember you considered this, this, and this. And then you said, oh yeah. So sometimes they forget why they made agreements, and you bring them back to the steps of the logical process, and they may go, oh yeah, that's right, I remember. Reviewing professionals, lawyers, financial professionals, parenting professionals, etc., to make sure your decisions are realistic. And do that while you're still in the process, so you can have another meeting with the mediator if things flare up. Sometimes they talk to people that say, you should fight for more. We'll find out why they're saying that, but the 2 parties should really be the decision makers. And sometimes you understand what you want, and you don't want to fight for more. What you want to fight for is peace, because you have a reasonable agreement, and that will bring you peace. Until things are signed, you can always make new proposals. Really depends on the mediation process. But sometimes it takes longer for high conflict people to reach agreements, and then they reach agreements. So having a degree of patience, if you're dealing with a partner who's a high conflict person and you're a reasonable person, is, you want to be firm, but also be flexible. So you can be patient with the other person and have the mediator help them get their questions answered so that you can finally have peace and have decisions. Now, I want to talk a little bit about pre-mediation coaching and the idea here that before mediation, what you do can help you have a more successful mediation. So we teach what we call the 4 big skills. And let me go. Yeah. So we teach the 4 big skills. We call them the 4 big skills for life, actually. That's flexible thinking instead of all or nothing thinking. Managed emotions instead of unmanaged emotions. Moderate behaviors instead of extreme behaviors. And checking yourself instead of blaming others and looking at what they're doing wrong. Now, we teach this in various forms. So we've taught this as a counseling method. We've taught this as an online class, and we've also taught this as coaching with an online class. And now I want to mention that you have available to you a program that we have trained coaches in our method called New Ways for Families. And New Ways for Families, we train people through Shared Parenting Scotland, and we've licensed them to use the method. And basically, they have 10 online classes, 10 online class sessions, and generally have 3 coaching sessions that go with that, although there may be some flexibility. And they did a pilot project, and now are doing it throughout the United Kingdom. And so there are other coaches in the UK, and one of them, of course, is Elaine Richardson. So if anybody has questions, you can ask her more about that. And that's a link to find out more information, etc. But preparing people for mediation makes them have more successful mediations. And frankly, I've had people who were prepared and they did their whole mediation in an hour because they came in with an agenda, they came in with proposals, they were both ready to do that. And they had an issue like developing a parenting plan. And the mediator was trained and had an hour for that. So you can really be more efficient by helping it be more problem solving and less emotionally reacting. So these are the 4 big skills for life. And of course, we teach people to teach their kids these skills. So flexible thinking instead of all or nothing thinking, managed emotions instead of unmanaged emotions, and moderate behavior instead of extreme behavior. And you're going to say, yeah, but what's the 4th skill? The 4th skill is checking yourself from time to time. Am I checking myself or am I checking out everybody else? So this helps people a lot. So I wanted to leave some time for questions and just mention, for those interested, we have a book on this approach, mediating high conflict disputes. And it basically contains about 100 tips for conflict resolution. And Michael Lomax, who is a mediator in British Columbia in Canada, and I were in regular correspondence and meetings over about 15 years as we developed this structured method. And we really found in our different mediations that it made things simpler. So high conflict mediation isn't only possible, I think it's the best way to go. And I want to also mention that probably 90% of mediations can handle high conflict cases and resolve them this way. But there are some cases that just aren't going to settle in mediation. So I want to acknowledge that, we have some like domestic violence situations, things like that, where it can be helpful in some settings, but also may not be in others. So this is some things that can help. And I can go to questions now. There, I left 15 minutes for questions. So that gives everybody a chance to participate. Let me just mention, I've got our website mentioned there, highconflictinstitute.com. We have a lot of free articles. Got about 50 free articles if you go to the website. We also sell books. Most of our books are in the $20 range. Some of them are $40. And we also have videos, video training for professionals and also for the average person. So we have a lot of resources. And we do consultation, and we actually do consultation worldwide by Zoom. I've had consultation with people on almost every continent, and not Antarctica yet. Anyway, so I'm open for questions, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Bill. We haven't had any questions posted in the Q&A yet, so if somebody wants to be the first person to fill something in there.
Well, actually, while we're waiting for a question, I have some additional bits of information. And one thing that's come up recently is people ask me, they say, high conflict people often want me to apologize for something that I didn't do. And they say, I can't work with you if you don't apologize to me for saying no or for ending a conversation. And the person who ended the conversation may have done that because the other person was being quite rude and insulting. And so people say, well, what should I do? I have to deal with this person, but I'm not going to apologize for something I didn't do. And in mediation, sometimes people bring that up. So what I say is, unless someone immediately apologizes, they both agree it's something to apologize for, that's fine. But if they say, I'm not going to apologize, I was appropriate in what I did, then I'll say, well, hang on, folks. Remember, my mediations are about the future. Apologies are about the past. So I don't do apologies in my mediations. I ask people what you want things to look like in the future. And that's what our focus is. So if something happened and you don't like how it went in the past, make a proposal for the future. So if someone cut off a conversation with you and you felt, and a high conflict person felt insulted by that, is say, well, look, what do you propose we do in the future? If I think that you're getting rude and I'm not comfortable in that conversation, what do you suggest that we do? And the other person will say, well, tell me when we can talk again, or, let's keep at it, or take a break and then come back 5 minutes later, or something like that. Okay, now we're proposing how to communicate in the future. That's productive, rather than saying you have to apologize for bad behavior when in fact the behavior was reasonable. I want to say on the flip side, sometimes reasonable people want high conflict people to apologize because they were rude, inconsiderate, or something like that. Well, high conflict people rarely apologize. So again, that's a non-starter. It's not going to go anywhere. So don't try to get an apology out of a high conflict person. Talk about what you want things to look like in the future. And that's more effective. So I call that apology quicksand. And the way to get out is just steer right around it and focus on the future.
And Bill, I was just going to add there, there's a similar approach, isn't there, to why questions. I know you've got an approach about why questions that I think goes quite nicely with this.
Yeah. So why questions often blow up because what they are is really a criticism. Is why did you think I would ever agree to that proposal? What they're really saying is no. You say, just keep it simple, say no. Because when you say why like that, you're criticizing the proposal, and that's putting us back in our defensiveness. And when you make each other defensive, you're just going to get stuck. So we really steer clear of why. And so I tell people, I say, ask logistical questions. Who would do what, when, and where? So like with that house example, maybe I should finish that. People are always curious, what happened with that? So with the house example, husband asked, how much can you pay? What have you found out about that? And it ended up that they reached an agreement that the wife got the house. And they got there without having to argue a lot because the focus stayed on logistical questions and the details of her proposal. When would the house title be changed to her? All of those things. And nowadays, a lot of people live together while they're getting divorced because it's hard economically. So you set a date for when you're moving out, when the other person gets the title to the house, things like that. But by keeping it logistical, the why questions kind of can stay out of the picture. And it's funny, people are very creative. Say, okay, I'm going to ask, and I'm going to say, how did you ever think I would agree to that? It's like, that's a why question.
It's a why question in disguise, isn't it, Bill?
Right, exactly.
Okay, we've
Yeah.
got some questions in the chat now, and I'm just going to deal with the first one. Well, there's a few actually that are all about the about shuttle mediation, separate spaces mediation. So Anna asked the question, what do you think about shuttle mediation? And then there's an anonymous attendee who's asked, does this concept apply to survivors of domestic abuse if conversations are on a shuttle basis? So if you could just perhaps deal with your approach towards shuttle.
Yeah. So first of all, shuttle mediation is fine. With family cases, with relationship cases, like in workplaces, communities, I think meeting together part of the time at least is preferred. But with high conflict cases, sometimes you just have to do the whole thing. Shuttle, you can use the same structure that I described. So both people make an agenda, talk about how we're going to go through the issues. Both people make proposals. And when the mediator is going to go talk to people in the other room is, do I have your permission to say a particular proposal? And while I'm doing that, think about other proposals, or think about how you could do the other side's proposal. So certainly shuttle mediation is fine, and you can do that. Now I want to talk particularly about domestic violence or domestic abuse. There's some research that was done here right before COVID hit, comparing shuttle mediation, virtual mediation where people saw each other on the screen, and going to court and in seeing each other at court. So this is the year before COVID. And what they found is that the preferred model was shuttle mediation, and that the parties and the mediator said they felt it was more successful than going to court because they didn't have to see each other escalate the tension between them. They appreciated not having to see each other, and they were able to make a fair number of agreements. They preferred that over virtual where they can see each other, like you and I see each other right now. Then COVID hit, and I asked one of the researchers who I knew, I said, so now that we're doing this all virtually, would you recommend that we use breakout rooms so people never have to see each other? So we go back and forth, do shuttle on virtual. And she said, yes, that seemed like the best approach. Pardon me. So, yeah, so we're very respectful of the needs in domestic abuse cases. And both people get triggered into their defensiveness when they see each other. So shuttle makes a lot of sense, even virtually.
Thanks, Bill.
Bill, I think I can speak for nearly everyone when I say that this is so interesting. And whenever I hear this talk, I always think, I know people away from work, I know people that this can help with and learn from. So thank you. There's been an absolute mountain of questions that have come through, and also a lot of people saying thank you for your time. Considering we're only got a few minutes left, I wonder if it might be most productive to talk about how people can continue to learn from you and from these methods. What are the best ways they can find out the answers to these questions within their own time? But also, how can they learn about this in the UK? You know, are there UK courses available to them? What do you recommend to everyone listening who's got all these questions to learn more?
Well, I'll just say some of it we can do through High Conflict Institute. And we've actually do trainings. We have trainings for mediators. We have a 12-hour training. It's 4 hours of pre-recorded online about high conflict situations, and then 2 4-hour days where we do practice exercises. So this is geared to professionals who are doing mediation. This could be mediators, therapists, others. We, like I said, have a lot of resources on our website. Now, in terms of what's available in the UK, I've mentioned the Shared Parenting Scotland and their coaches. So if parents are curious about that, there's that email link that I showed on the screen. And I don't know if people caught that or if that's someplace that they can get that.
Yeah, you share it with us, Bill. We can share that with the attendees.
Yeah. So I think you have, I don't know if they have as a handout, but the slides they can have as a handout, and I can send the updated slides that have that one with Shared Parenting Scotland.
That's great, Bill. And I was just going to say, to add to what James has said, that I just direct people to the Family Mediation Council website and the other Family Mediation Week recordings and resources.
Great. And sometimes if there's questions here that we didn't get a chance to answer that you want, is you could, the organizer could email me the questions, and I can do like paragraph responses, email them back, and you can send them out to anyone that wishes to see those answers. So I've done that sometimes. It's funny, webinars have so much information, they stimulate so many questions, and there isn't time to really address them all. But that's one way. I'm happy to do a group email like that.
Yeah, Bill, we'll definitely arrange that. And we have done that before with Family Mediation Week webinars, where there's been a huge amount of interest. So we can gather together some questions, get you to answer them, and then let everybody know and hopefully publish it on the website or something.
And Elaine and I are always doing as much as we can to get Bill over in England to be here in person, to see you all and meet you all. So keep an eye out if something like that happens in the future.
I'm wide open. Last year I got to be there twice and I really loved it. So it'd be great to visit again.
Fantastic. We'd love to have you, Bill. Well, I just wanted to round up now to thank Bill so much for this absolutely fascinating talk. It's generated huge amounts of interest, and I hope we can carry on the conversation. And thanks so much to James as well for assisting, and really interesting to know about how the High Conflict Institute and our Family Wizard have developed together. Thank you both so much, and thank you all for attending. We really appreciate it and hope you can sign into some more of the great webinars that will be coming our way during Family Mediation Week. Thanks, everyone. Bye.